19th of June 1944, over the chalk of the South Downs, a Luftwaffe U-88D from Aufklärungsgruppe 122 rides a thin layer of broken cloud, the pilot smelling hot oil and cordite while the sun flashes off hedgerows below. He follows a freight consist hammering east, boxcars, flats, a black 460 throwing a pale feather of steam until, without warning, the rails spear into a wooded slope near Petersfield and the train simply ceases to exist. No plume, no dust, only dappled green and the white scarp of chalk. He circles once, twice. Photographs show nothing but coppice and pasture stitched with camouflage shade. He radios a perplexed note. The line enters the hillside. Hours later, analysts on the French coast mark a second report. Similar wagons reappear at Southampton and Portsmouth, their loads already broken down into lorries nosing toward embarkation hards for Normandy. By late June, this pattern repeats. Aerial prints, stamped, measured, argued over, show rail arteries that fade into blank country, then cargo surfacing as if through soil. Some in the Abwehr suggest vast new tunnels. Others mutter about decoy smoke plants and teleportation in derision that is not entirely sure of itself. The more sober files list place names: Chilmark and Monkton Farley in Wiltshire, where a mile-long spur runs into Bathstone quarries converted since 1941 into the central ammunition depot. Farley down sidings where wagons vanish beneath a chalk face. Covered loading yards masked under netting and fake farm roofs. What looks like sorcery is discipline. Camouflage paint, buried platforms, and civil engineer cunning married to a railway timetable that feeds invasion at night and leaves daylight empty. To grasp how a hillside could swallow a locomotive, we have to go back decades. To the quarries and Victorian bores Britain quietly turned into war. The idea was born not in the chaos of 1940, but in the quiet dread of the interwar years. Britain had learned the lesson of exposure early. During the Great War, when the slow, thudding approach of Gotha bombers sent Londoners diving for cover, the War Office watched whole freight yards vanish in firestorms. Open rails meant open targets. By the late 1930s, as Hitler's Reich built the Luftwaffe into a weapon of precision terror, British strategists understood that the next war would be fought not just in the skies, but in the unseen arteries that fed the front. With radar still in its infancy and fighter command stretched thin, logistics itself had to disappear from view. In 1938, under a cloud of official secrecy, engineers began experimenting with what they called subterranean dispersal. Disused rail tunnels, some carved nearly a century earlier during the Great Railway boom, became the foundation of an audacious plan. Box Tunnel in Wiltshire, Isambard Kingdom Brunel's masterpiece of Victorian engineering, offered the perfect model. 1.83 miles of continuous brick vault, tall enough for double-track traffic, cool, dry, and invisible from the air. Within its shadowed chambers, survey teams from the Royal Engineers began measuring temperature, humidity, and rock stability. If a tunnel could hide an entire train, it could also protect munitions, fuel, and spare parts from bombers that could obliterate surface depots in minutes. By the time war came in September 1939, conversion work had already begun. Old sidings were strengthened, ventilation widened, and underground storage chambers blasted into the surrounding Bathstone. When the Blitz began in 1940, the concept became doctrine. The subterranean dispersal program expanded into a vast network beneath Britain's chalk and limestone, linking hidden sidings, loading galleries, and buried magazines. It was not just defense, it was foresight. A buried infrastructure ready to feed a future invasion across the Channel, built while the nation's fate hung in blackout and silence. September 1940. The first wave of Heinkel He-111s crossed the Channel just after dusk, their engines a rolling thunder that never seemed to end. Below, the rails of Britain's southern network glowed faintly under blackout lamps, arteries of war exposed to the sky. Within weeks, the Luftwaffe found their rhythm. Freight yards at Bristol were flattened, Southampton's sidings churned into twisted iron, and the great marshalling yards of Eastleigh and Willesden were burning again before they could be cleared. Every night, Locomotives hissed in the dark while their crews prayed the bombs would fall elsewhere. Every morning, the rails had to be rebuilt. The War Cabinet, staring at maps littered with red pins, understood what that meant. Without supply trains, Britain would starve before she was invaded. In October, an emergency directive went out, Order S-3141, demanding that all critical munitions, fuel, and rolling stock be moved below ground wherever possible. What had been an experimental idea under the subterranean dispersal program now became a national mission. The Royal Engineers partnered with the Great Western and Southern Railway companies to turn natural caverns, disused quarries, and abandoned mines into functioning depots. Beneath Corsham in Wiltshire, surveyors marked out an immense grid of galleries beneath 240 feet of rock. The project would become known by its later Cold War codename, Burlington, but in 1940 it was simply the Corsham Depot. Within a year, whole supply trains could roll into the hillside, vanish behind blast-proof sliding doors, and be unloaded under concrete vaults, shielded from every bomb the Reich could drop. Across southern England, other quarries, Chilmark, Monkton Farley, Tunnel Quarry became secret citadels of logistics. Hidden spur lines ran through hedgerows disguised with timber screens and camouflage netting. False sidings and dummy trains were built to mislead reconnaissance photographs. From above, the landscape seemed abandoned. Below, it throbbed with life. Locomotives shunting, cranes lifting shells, and the echo of footsteps in chalk dust. By late 1941, the Southern Command could move hundreds of tons of ammunition each night without a single wisp of smoke to betray them. In the darkness of the Blitz, Britain's survival had literally gone underground, an empire beneath the earth, forged in secrecy that would one day power the road to Normandy. By 1942, the British Underground Rail Network had become a masterpiece of engineering secrecy, but its survival now depended on illusion. Every week, the Luftwaffe's reconnaissance squadrons scoured the English countryside with Zeiss-lensed cameras, searching for the faintest sign of movement or smoke. Their analysts in occupied France studied thousands of prints, convinced that somewhere beneath those quiet Wiltshire meadows, something enormous was happening. To keep them guessing, the War Office turned to deception as refined as any weapon. The Camouflage Directorate of the Royal Engineers, born from the strange marriage of artists, stage designers, and surveyors, took command of what was codenamed Operation Camouflage. The principles that would later shape Operation Fortitude, Britain's great D-Day deception, were first tested here. Railway entrances were masked behind hinged barns whose weathered planks could swing open like gates. Canvas hills rose overnight to cover new tunnel mouths, their shapes measured to cast the same shadows as natural slopes at dawn and dusk. Whole dummy farms were constructed above the Corsham sidings, complete with artificial hedgerows, papier-mâché cattle, and straw that never moved in the wind. Beneath these pastoral mirages, the reality was thunder and grit. Forklifts clattered, cranes lifted shells, and trains rolled into caverns deep under the chalk. Yet above ground, not a single wisp of light or smoke betrayed them. Light discipline was absolute. Hooded lamps, blackout curtains, and signal systems buried under stone. To further confound German analysts, the British built busy sidings miles away, lined with wooden locomotives and smoke pots that sent plumes skyward for reconnaissance aircraft to photograph. The Luftwaffe dutifully logged these as active depots, while the true arteries of Britain's war effort pulsed invisibly below. By 1943, German intelligence officers were divided. Some whispered that Britain had built an underground railway network. Others dismissed it as absurd fantasy. Both were right and wrong. The deception had worked so flawlessly that even as trains vanished into the earth, the Reich could only guess at the scale of what lay hidden there. Soon that hidden machinery would serve a new and world-changing purpose, supplying the invasion of Europe. By the closing months of 1943, the subterranean empire beneath southern England was no longer a defensive marvel. It had become the beating heart of Operation Overlord. The same tunnels that once sheltered munitions from the Blitz were now the hidden conduits of invasion. Beneath Corsham's bathstone vaults, at Monkton Farley's endless galleries, and in the cool chalk chambers of Chilmark, soldiers of the Royal Engineers and U.S. Army Transportation Corps worked shoulder to shoulder under flickering bulbs. Crates marked for special operations lined the walls beside drums of petrol, oil, and lubricants, POL, the lifeblood of mechanized war. Every item was catalogued, loaded, and sealed within trains that the world would never see. Each underground siding connected through secret spur lines to coastal terminals at Portsmouth, Southampton, and Weymouth. These exits were camouflaged as disused rural branches or empty sidings behind false warehouses. When a train finally surfaced, it did so only at night or beneath heavy cloud cover, disguised as ordinary freight. In the daylight hours, the Luftwaffe saw only quiet fields and idle rails, unaware that thousands of tons of materiel were moving below their gaze. Between February and June 1944, an estimated 2.5 million tons of supplies, vehicles, ammunition, rations, and fuel passed through these hidden arteries, enough to sustain the coming invasion for 6 relentless weeks of combat. The system's precision astonished even Eisenhower's logisticians. Locomotives ran to the minute, guarded by light discipline and strict silence. Not one major supply convoy was struck by German bombers. To enemy analysts, British rail activity appeared to decline before June, suggesting no immediate invasion. In truth, the tunnels had made Britain's preparations invisible. Beneath the pastoral calm of the English countryside, an army was already in motion, its iron heartbeat echoing toward the sea. By February 1944, German intelligence was drowning in contradictions. The Abwehr Section 3, responsible for logistics analysis, had begun assembling reports from agents across occupied France and neutral ports. Freight volumes moving into Britain's southern harbors had doubled since autumn, yet Luftwaffe reconnaissance revealed almost no corresponding train activity inland. Rail yards that should have been bursting with wagons looked eerily empty. Something was moving vast quantities of material, but no one could see it. In Paris, Oberst Heinrich Höhne and his analytical cells struggled to explain the discrepancy. Their March summary concluded that British transport is employing underground or enclosed railways between interior and coastal zones. The notion was dismissed by OKW headquarters as technically absurd, a fantasy born of poor reconnaissance. But the Luftwaffe's own photo interpreters were unsettled. Their maps showed depots refueled and resupplied in a single night, with no record of daylight trains. Ultra-decrypts after the war would reveal just how frantic their recalculations became. Targeting models rewritten, bombing priorities shifted, and still no understanding of where the British were hiding their logistics. The confusion seeped into other branches. Reports circulated among V-weapon planning teams mentioning the English Underworld Railway. Captured Luftwaffe pilots, questioned after D-Day, spoke of ghost trains that never appeared on film yet always produced consequences. Tank columns, fuel dumps, and ammunition caches that materialized overnight. In desperation, some Abwehr officers speculated about giant tunneling machines or a secret railway running under the channel itself. Each theory collapsed under its own improbability, but none could explain the numbers. The truth was simpler and far beyond their reach. Beneath chalk and limestone, trains rumbled unseen, feeding an army poised for liberation. To the men of the Abwehr, it was as though Britain had learned to make steel vanish into earth. The network that sustained Britain's war effort was not merely a patchwork of forgotten tunnels. It was a machine built in darkness. Beginning in 1941, as the Blitz still raged above, the Royal Engineers tunneling companies, veterans of the infernos beneath Ypres and Messines, returned to their silent trade. But this time, they carried not shovels and candles, but pneumatic drills, diesel compressors, and blueprints drawn for an invisible railway. They dug galleries wide enough for double tracks, chambers for sidings, and arches ribbed with reinforced concrete that could bear the shock of near misses from 500-pound bombs. The earth swallowed their work, one measured blast at a time. The scale was staggering. At Corsham, the heart of the underground system, the labyrinth stretched across 240 acres beneath Wiltshire's limestone, a buried city of rails and steel. Inside, 40 trains could be parked nose to tail in hidden sidings. Workshops repaired locomotives under arched roofs of chalk-white stone. Signal cabins and control rooms glowed dimly under hooded bulbs, wired to surface telegraph lines and field telephones that connected the underground empire to the national grid. Air was drawn through disguised shafts that emerged among cottages and barns, their vents camouflaged under fake chimneys. Generators rumbled miles away, feeding the network's electric fans that held the temperature at a steady 60 degrees. Ideal for ammunition, food, and fuel. Here, machinery and precision met silence. Every movement was measured. To avoid vibrations detectable by enemy seismographs or microphones planted by imagined spies, trains coasted into their sidings at walking pace, engines idled, and loading was done with electric trolleys. Civilians living nearby never guessed. The only sign was a faint, rhythmic hum beneath the hedgerows. By 1943, over 30 miles of underground track crisscrossed southern England, a hidden circulatory system ready to feed invasion. Soon, this buried marvel would face its greatest trial, supplying the war now leaping across the Channel. June 6, 1944, D-Day. As the first paratroopers dropped through the night and the beaches of Normandy erupted in flame and chaos, another war engine stirred far from the front, deep beneath the quiet hills of Wiltshire. Inside the tunnels of Corsham, engines shunted to life, their smoke absorbed by filters, their wheels grinding softly against rails that had never seen sunlight. Within hours of the invasion's opening salvo, the underground railway network that had been Britain's secret reserve transformed into the logistical lifeline of Operation Neptune, the naval arm of Overlord. By dawn on June 7th, trains began emerging from their hidden mouths at Monkton Farleigh and Chilmark, loaded with amphibious vehicles, artillery rounds, and sealed ration crates. Each convoy moved under the protection of cloud and darkness toward the southern ports, Weymouth, Southampton, Portsmouth, where camouflaged depots waited behind screens of naval smoke. Their cargo was ferried across the Channel on landing craft, replenishing divisions still fighting to secure the beaches. The Luftwaffe, scanning from Cherbourg and Le Havre, saw only smoke and mist. In the first week of the invasion, more than 400 supply trains moved undisturbed, their routes concealed, their schedules precise to the minute. To German observers, it was a logistics miracle that defied reconnaissance logic. As the beachheads widened, the same principles that had made the British tunnels so effective were exported to Normandy. U.S. Army engineers, awed by the speed and secrecy of Britain's underground operations, began converting captured German bunkers and quarries into forward supply depots. Fuel lines, ammunition tracks, even field hospitals began appearing beneath French soil, echoes of the hidden empire beneath England. Meanwhile, British intelligence fed the Luftwaffe false reports of surface rail congestion, luring bombers toward empty sidings and decoy yards. Above ground, Germany struck shadows. Below, the real arteries of Neptune pulsed, unseen and unstoppable, carrying the invasion toward victory. By August 1944, the war in Western Europe had become a race, steel and fuel against distance. The breakout from Saint-Lô had torn open the German line, and Patton's Third Army was driving toward Paris at a pace that stunned even Allied planners. Yet every tank, shell, and ration that made that momentum possible still traced its origin back to the silent tunnels of southern England. Beneath Corsham, Monkton Farleigh, and Chilmark, trains were still loading day and night, hidden, regulated, and tireless. They would vanish into the darkness beneath Wiltshire and reappear at the coastal sidings of Southampton, Dover, and Weymouth, their cargo already queued for the Channel crossing. Within 48 hours, what had been underground in Britain was rolling across the Hedgerows of France. These tunnels had become the backbone of a transoceanic supply chain, now interwoven with Operation Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean. The same hidden sidings that once carried ammunition, now pumped petrol through. Flexible pipes stretching to Cherbourg and later to Boulogne, feeding the armored columns of Patton's spearhead. Without these concealed loading points, the pipeline could not have been maintained or defended. Their invisibility kept the fuel flowing even as the Luftwaffe searched in vain for the source. Each buried mile of track was a shield against air raids, each camouflaged depot another victory of silence over spectacle. In Berlin, intelligence officers pored over reports that made no sense. Goebbels's propaganda machine mocked the Allied ghost trains, dismissing them as Anglo-Saxon fairy tales. But on the ground, those fairy tales burned real fuel, fired real shells, and moved real armies. The Luftwaffe could still dominate the sky, but it no longer mattered. Britain's buried rails had made the Allied supply chain untouchable, a shadow network that kept victory rolling eastward. By the autumn of 1944, the Third Reich was watching its own rail empire collapse under fire. Allied bombers had shredded the marshalling yards of Cologne, Kassel, and Essen. Freight corridors, once pulsing with coal and armor, were now graveyards of twisted track. Yet inside the offices of the Reichsbahn and Luftwaffe Logistics Command, one question refused to die. How had Britain managed to make its trains invisible? The British supply machine, feeding millions of troops across the Channel, seemed to move without air cover, without losses, without logic. In desperation, the Reich attempted imitation. At Kassel and Essen, engineers began carving reinforced sidings into hillsides, an echo of what they imagined must exist beneath England. But construction collapsed under the same bombs that had forced the British underground in the first place. The Abwehr, humiliated by its failure to uncover the truth, launched a final series of infiltration attempts. Agents were dispatched toward Southampton and Bristol, ordered to confirm the disappearing train phenomenon firsthand. None made it past coastal security. Ultra-decrypts after the war revealed even Hitler's personal involvement. He demanded an explanation for Britain's under-earth system, alternately ridiculing and fearing it. Captured officers from Normandy only worsened the mystery, describing Allied supplies that arrived from nowhere. Inside German analysis rooms, exhausted officers argued over theories ranging from magnetic rail camouflage to corridors of artificial fog. None guessed the truth, that Britain's secret lay not in magic or machines, but in tunnels, discipline, and geometry. While German trains burned under relentless Allied air assault, British locomotives rolled unseen, untouched, unstoppable. The irony was total. The Reich that had pioneered terror from the sky was now blind beneath it. In the twilight of 1944, the Luftwaffe ruled the heavens, and the British ruled the earth below. Life beneath Britain's green fields was unlike any other front of the war. In the tunnels of Corsham, Monkton Farleigh, and Chilmark, the air never changed. It hung cool and damp at 55 degrees, carrying the smell of oil, limestone dust, and old steam. The workers, Royal Engineers, railway troops, and civilian laborers moved through that twilight world in endless rhythm. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, their footsteps echoing between concrete walls. Electric lamps flickered overhead, throwing long shadows across stacked crates of shells and rations marked to Normandy. It was a world without sunlight, a place where time blurred into the pulse of engines and the hiss of compressed air. Many lived almost entirely underground. Simple bunks were carved into alcoves along the walls, close to the warmth of the generators. Meals came from field kitchens hidden in side chambers, the smell of stew mingling with diesel fumes. When they emerged, briefly, for a breath of fresh air or to see a sliver of dawn, the brightness hurt their eyes. Letters home often called it a world without sky. Yet morale rarely faltered. Painted slogans, "Our work feeds the front," lined the tunnel walls, reminders that the monotony below sustained life above. Among the workers were hundreds of women from the Women's Voluntary Service, their hands ink-stained from ledgers and telephones. They kept meticulous records, every shell, ration tin, and gallon of petrol logged with military precision. Secrecy bound them all. Even to their families, they could say only that they worked for the Ministry of Supply. Psychologists later observed how anonymity became its own badge of honor, a quiet pride in serving unseen, yet knowing that victory depended on their hidden hands. When news of D-Day finally filtered underground, men and women who had lived for years in shadow stood weeping beside the rails. The trains they had loaded in silence had carried freedom itself across the sea, and their world, invisible to the enemy, would soon fade back into the earth it had served. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the victory that thundered across Europe owed as much to what lay beneath Britain's soil as to the armies that crossed it. The network of hidden tunnels, those steel veins carved through chalk and limestone, had given the Allies something the Reich never possessed after 1943: certainty of supply. While German logistics collapsed under the weight of Allied bombing, Britain's trains ran untouched, invisible, and precise. Ammunition, fuel, and food flowed to the Channel without pause, sustaining the invasion and every offensive that followed. In the months after D-Day, historians would struggle to measure its true impact. Some compared the underground railway system to radar or ultra, the unseen weapons that changed the war's balance. By shielding the arteries of transport, Britain achieved what had once seemed impossible: a supply network immune to air power. For the commanders directing Overlord and the push through France, it meant freedom. Operations planned without fear that a single bombing raid might sever the front from its lifeline. The Wehrmacht, forced to operate under constant air attack, could only envy such stability. Post-war studies revealed the scale of the achievement. For every ton of German materiel lost to bombing, Britain preserved 2 through underground dispersal. The system embodied a new doctrine of modern warfare: protection through concealment. It was industrial camouflage elevated to strategy. Eisenhower himself would later write, "Victory depended not only on courage at the front, but on invisibility at home." The Germans had called them vanishing trains, never realizing they symbolized a deeper truth: that survival in the age of total war no longer belonged to what could be seen, but to what could endure unseen beneath the earth, silent and unstoppable. When peace came in 1945, the rails beneath Britain fell silent at last. The locomotives that had once carried the lifeblood of an army were uncoupled and forgotten, their tunnels sealed behind iron doors. Yet even in silence, the legacy of that hidden world endured. At Corsham, the vast warren that had once sheltered supply trains was reborn as a Cold War command center, its chambers fitted with blast doors and communications rooms designed to survive nuclear fire. Moncton Farley became a storage site for NATO cables and weapon stockpiles. Others, like Chilmark and Ridge Quarry, were simply abandoned, left to the slow drip of groundwater and the rusting of rails in perpetual dusk. For decades, the story remained classified. It was not until the 1970s that historians and journalists began to piece together what had happened beneath the Wiltshire Hills: hundreds of thousands of square feet of tunnels, workshops, sidings, and storage bays, all built in secrecy, all hidden from the eyes of the world. When post-war German engineers were shown fragments of the Allied blueprints, they reportedly shook their heads in disbelief. One called them industrial catacombs of victory. The irony was inescapable. The same nation that had once commanded the air had never glimpsed the world that defeated it beneath the earth. Modern planners studied the designs for Cold War bunkers and NATO logistics depots. The principle, concealment as protection, became a cornerstone of modern defense. Even as warfare grew digital and remote, the logic of the underground remained: What cannot be seen cannot be destroyed. Today, those ghost tunnels lie beneath fields of quiet grass and chalk, unseen, but still potent. They stand as monuments not of destruction, but of endurance, the silent proof that Britain's greatest strength once lay below the surface. Years later, an old farmer near Corsham would remember lying awake as a boy during the war, hearing a deep, steady rumble beneath his fields. He thought it was thunder rolling across the downs. It wasn't. It was the heartbeat of an invisible war machine, steel wheels echoing through tunnels that no enemy aircraft ever found, carrying munitions, rations, and hope toward the sea. The Germans had called them Geisterzüge, ghost trains, and in a sense, they were right. These trains existed between worlds, seen by no one, yet felt everywhere the war was fought. They were driven by men who never saw a battlefield, and loaded by women whose names history never recorded. In their silence, they turned Britain's greatest weakness, its exposure to the sky, into its greatest strength. Every mile of buried rail, every hidden siding was a defiance of terror, a transformation of fear into foresight. Beneath the calm of the English countryside, among chalk and limestone and dripping stone, lay an empire of endurance that confounded the Reich and fueled liberation. When the war ended, the engines went cold, and the tunnels fell quiet again. The rumble faded into memory. Yet deep under the green hills, those tracks still sleep in darkness, a hidden monument to the truth that victory is not always won in the light, but often in the places where no one is watching.